So the Liberal budget has been released recently, and the Liberals have decided to take their own spin on the state of the economy, and their faithful supporters have eaten the cake. It's a narrative based on the belief that it's the party of government surpluses, whereas the ALP is the party of deficits. If we look at the government debt ratio, we can see where they're coming from. It's stupid to just look at this simple chart and attribute the declining government debt under the Liberals to be good economic management alone, because that ignores the role of good luck. The Liberals have been the lucky party in the lucky country. They were lucky to be in office at the right time, which made it easy for the government to reduce its debt, and then lucky to lose office when economic circumstances turned sour and government spending inevitably had to rise. Today I'm going to debunk the budget and what it means to all Australians, because some people just don't get it and don't understand economics, especially Joe Hockey. Unlike other people, I'm not going to focus on the cuts and whether or not the Liberal Party has been fair income to the Australian public. I'm focusing on the economics of the budget instead. The reason Joe Hockey intends to make cuts is to deliver a surplus, and this is because he is obsessed about gross public debt.
But the gross debt, which is subject to the debt limit, the debt is going to pass $300 billion. And now it's 300.
While Joe Hockey is correct about the gross debt, the truth is Australia has one of the lowest public debts to the size of our economy, with a government debt of 24% of GDP. Whereas most developed nations in the OECD average at 90%. Joe Hockey seems to think reducing or eliminating the public debt of Australians is a good thing. False. The deficit the government has is not a good or bad thing. It's actually more like a barometer these days. Just listen to the father of modern monetary theory, Warren Mosler, has to say about low deficit spending and surpluses on the American economy.
There's this notion that somehow we're getting the deficit under control. This is a great thing. This is why stock markets are buoyant, and you have a somewhat different view about that.
Well, yeah, that's what ends the business cycle.
Yeah.
This is the real deficit crisis is when they get too small. So, for example, in 2006, the deficit got too small, under 1% of GDP. Wasn't enough to support the credit structure, and it all came apart. You could say the same thing about the late 1990s, when we allowed the deficit to go into surplus. The economy was sustained by the private sector doing its own deficit spending at 7% of GDP, which was totally unsustainable and triggered that collapse that we handed President Bush. And before that, I'll get my years straight here, we had the deficit got too small under Bush Sr. with the Bush tax hikes, caused a big recession of 1990.
And there seems to be this implicit notion that somehow public debt is inherently more destabilizing than private sector debt.
Right.
That somehow it's okay for us to run up loads of private credit, even though arguably that's what created the foundations for the 2008 crisis.
Yeah, I remember that in the 90s when they were saying, the private debt growing at 7% is sustainable, but a public debt of 1 or 2% is not sustainable. Well, of course, it's exactly the opposite.
Because, of course, a government being the monopoly issuer of the currency.
Right, and in fact, if you look closely at the accounts, and as a simple point of logic, government has to spend first and then collect taxes. It has to spend first and then borrow. Okay, otherwise, how are the dollars to pay taxes and to lend to the government going to be out there? It's like the football stadium. It doesn't collect the tickets first and then sell them. Okay,
yeah.
Anybody who issues anything has to get it out there first and then collect it. Where the users, all the other people, they have to get the dollars first before they can spend them.
By calculating the maths of it all, Tony and Joe are expecting a private debt growth of 6.2% or more for the next decade. However, that's assuming that the economy will grow at 5% from 2015 onwards, which hasn't happened since the turn of the century. Assuming that 1 to 2% of government debt is unsustainable, and 6 to 8% of private debt is sustainable is very myopic. At the moment, The private sector debt in Australia, which is the sum of household plus business debt, is now 145% of GDP. Let me repeat that for you, 145%. However, the budget is going to require more private debt. In fact, it's going to soar up like a hockey stick to 250%. To give you an idea how much that is, Netherlands is the most private indebted nation in the OECD, of just 220%. By the end of 2024, we will have gone from 145% to 250%. So borrow up big, Australians. Joe's hockey stick needs you to do it if the Liberals are to hang on to the mantle of Australia's lucky party. Personally, my money is that it will fail, and we're in for a much lower rate of growth for Australia than the budget anticipates. I hope this video has shined a different aspect onto what the budget means to Australians. And that's all for now.
And they're going to ask whoever's elected after the 14th of September to increase the credit card limit, and that's not good enough.
But every respected economist we've spoken to, we had NAB's chief economist Alan Oster on our show yesterday saying debt is not a problem.
No, because they don't have to repay it.
Is the lowest amongst a lot of Western nations.
Well, but
they're not worried about.
I love economists. They've always got an opinion, but they actually never have to repay it. And the only people that repay it are the taxpayers of Australia.